It's been over a year since my wife began a romance with Edward Pattinson. I had no idea why I allowed this to continue for so long. Maybe it was because I was comfortable. Once I realized what was happening, I didn't care anymore. I patiently waited for the day she would present me with divorce papers. I did nothing to prepare except to compose myself mentally. I resigned myself to the fact that she would take half of everything I had accumulated with her. She would happily take this house and furniture. The estimated value was less than it is now on mortgage. We had saved exactly enough money to cover 4 years of college for our daughter, Jenny. In 3 more years, I would transfer ownership of the company, and she would probably demand a portion of those funds. Marcia was fairly restrained about her affair. The biggest issue was that Pattinson worked in the same company as I did. He worked in a different department and earned a salary 1 level higher. At least he was single and fairly attractive. What I didn't like was his arrogance. It was easy for me to avoid him at work, and the only time I had to interact with him was in the company's social department. Everything was resolved fairly quickly. Jenny went off to her first semester at Penn State, and Marcia and I were alone at home for the first time in 18 years. Normally, this would have been a good opportunity for a couple to increase their sexual activity, but not in our home. Marcia was always too tired or too busy, and I didn't care anymore. It was Saturday morning. Marcia was in the shower, and I was still reading the morning newspaper when the phone rang. I wasn't expecting a call, so I just let it go to voicemail. It was, to say the least, an interesting message. "It's Malcolm Jewelers calling. Engraving on your watches is finished, and you can pick them up anytime. Thank you." Well, that was interesting. I don't wear watches and never have. It really bothered me that there was something hanging on my wrist. Marcia had no reason to engrave anything on her watches, and Jenny used her mobile phone to check the time. I've never been one to indulge in my wife's whims or anything else, but today I felt a strong desire. The receipt from the jeweler's shop was stuffed in the pocket where he kept his credit cards. I read it carefully. Happy Tag Heuer Carrera watches with black alligator leather strap. Engraving on the back, "Forever. Marcia, $3,900. Fully paid." I carefully placed it back and grabbed myself a cold beer. I damn well knew this wasn't for me. Marcia had just returned to the living room as I stepped outside to start trimming the lawn. It took twice as long as usual to finish the yard work, but it gave me a good chance to think things over. After lunch, Marcia informed me that she was planning to spend the night at her sister's house in Frackville. She didn't miss the broad smile on my face. I spent the rest of the evening getting my affairs in order. I had a whole year to do this, but I waited until the last minute. I scolded myself for procrastinating, but I was glad to have finally made a decision. She returned home around noon on Sunday. We were close in proximity but hardly spoke to each other. It was the longest Sunday of my life. That night, I slept on the couch. Monday morning started off normal at work until Edward started showing off his new watch to all his colleagues. I had resigned myself to all of this until he glanced at me with a wide grin on his face. Up until that moment, he had always been calm and silent about the affair, but now he was gloating. Big mistake. I immediately took a week off and then informed the personnel that I was now ready for a transfer to the office in Baltimore. The new job came with a promotion and a salary increase. I had declined it several times before because Marcia and Jenny didn't want to move. The rest of the day, I spent at the bank and with my lawyer. I made an offer to give Marcia everything, but without alimony and without a share of my future pension. She could have all the money left after we paid for Jenny's education. With such high earnings at college, as they were, there wasn't much left. My wife wasn't home when I moved all my things into a small apartment near work. On Tuesday, I rested. The divorce papers were delivered to Marcia midweek. She called me. "John, do you want to explain this? Do you want to discuss anything?" "No, why'd I have to sign these papers?" "Marcia, this has been long overdue, and you know it. Signing the papers will just fix everything. I'm the one getting the short end of the stick. You lose nothing and gain everything. You're not offering any support. I gave you 20 years, and you're offering nothing. If I included alimony, it would only be until you remarried again. I thought it would be a waste of time. This way, it'll all be over in 90 days. If you want to change anything, I can guarantee it'll take more than a year. I just want to move on. So, I understand you're really moving?" "Oh, and who told you that?" Of course, I knew the answer. Does it matter? At the moment, no. There was a pause in the conversation. Marcia, I am someone who has been hurt here. I'm the one who's being forced to move. I've done nothing wrong, and yet I'm being punished. I've known everything about Paddington for years. Just sign the damn papers. I'm sorry, John. I never wanted this to happen. Tomorrow, I'll hand them over to the lawyers. For me, it was a perfect opportunity to shift the blame onto her, but I refused to give her that satisfaction. On Friday, I arrived at work and cleared my desk. No one expected to see me, and a few people expressed their objections about my failure to organize a proper farewell party. I wasn't in the mood for festivities. It took me less than an hour to tidy up. Before leaving, I called Jenny and explained the situation as best I could. How do you tell your daughter that you're leaving because of her mother without explaining the disrespectful reason? She asked once and then dropped the subject, as if she had some idea of what was happening. I couldn't understand how she couldn't know, considering it was so long ago. I had a feeling she understood. The trip to Baltimore was somber. All I could think about was the life I had built with Marcia and how easily it was shattered. I had always planned to settle down with her. Now I had no plans for the future. In reality, I didn't care. Marcia never once apologized for her actions and didn't even acknowledge them. We avoided that topic. Naturally, we both knew what was happening, but neither of us wanted to be the first to bring it up. A man can cope with all this crap, thinking about everything. I turned on the radio. Who the hell is Lady Gaga anyway? The new job was simpler than I expected. To put it mildly, I was overqualified. Thanks to my competence and self-assurance, subordinates felt comfortable around me. It was supposed to be a good move. I kept in touch with Jenny, and she shared all the information she had about her mother with me. Paddington moved in with Marcia to our house a week after I left. Jenny was unhappy, and I couldn't blame her. Marcia signed and agreed to all the terms of the divorce. She didn't even hire her own lawyer. Everything was proceeding according to plan, and all I could do now was wait. When we approached the point where there were only 3 weeks left until the finalization of the divorce, I signed up for a 10-day cruise in the Caribbean. I hated cruises, but this one was necessary. On the weekends before my planned departure, I met with old friends from back home in Atlantic City. I treated them to wine, dined with them, and entertained them. It was nice to have old friends. It was a long 10 days at sea. I couldn't decide what I hated more, the food or the other guests. At times, I could swear I was being pursued by at least 3 lonely women. At least, I thought they were lonely. I made use of all the ports of call to dispel the boredom. When I finally returned home, I was greeted by several guests. They were detectives from Baltimore, but they were there at the request of the Pennsylvania State Police. Howard Paddison's body had been found at a rest area on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. He had been beaten with what appeared to be a baseball bat and died en route to the local hospital. His wallet and watch were taken, so the first indication was that it was a botched robbery. When investigators uncovered the relationship between Paddington and Marcia, I became the prime suspect. It took local law enforcement less than 30 minutes to confirm that I had indeed been on a cruise for the past 10 days. The Pennsylvania State Police saw no need for further investigation. I had no less than a dozen messages on my phone. Jenny had told her mother about my plans to go on a cruise, but Marcia insisted on trying to reach me. Marcia knew I hated cruises. One of the calls was from Jenny, so I returned her call. Jenny, I just got back from my cruise. What the hell happened? No one knows for sure. Mom's beside herself. Howard didn't come home from work one day, and that night they found him on the highway near downtown. He was beaten and died before they could get him to the hospital. When did this happen? Last Thursday. Well, last Thursday I was in Cancun, so it wasn't me. Mom swears you have something to do with it, but there's no evidence to support that. I've just spent quite a bit of time with the local police here, and they seem satisfied with my story. So why is your mother trying to get in touch with me? She's completely lost. She doesn't have you, and now she's lost Howard. She said something about trying to stop the divorce. Can she do that? Not without my consent. If I had waited a few more days, I wouldn't have had this problem. The following week was filled with phone calls from Marcia and a lawyer named Winstead. I ignored them all. 2 days before the divorce was supposed to be finalized, I received a registered letter demanding my signature. My secretary managed to delay the delivery so I could leave the building. I spent the next 3 days in Atlantic City. Before heading home, I called my lawyer. He congratulated me on successfully thwarting Marcia's attempts to stop the divorce, then asked me for another $10,000 to cover expenses. After a few awkward moments, he started laughing. It was a crappy little joke, but it added some levity to the situation. Instead of money, he said he'd settle for a steak dinner. It was worth it. I still thought it was a crappy joke. I never quite understood why the police dropped the investigation into Paddington's murder or why they stopped contacting me. Jenny called and also congratulated, but, of course, restrained, as befits a child who sees their parents splitting up. Marcia was in deep depression. Her sister Sherry lived with her for a while. It turned out she suddenly realized she had financial problems. Serious financial problems. I smiled as I hung up the phone. For the next 2 years, I had no contact with Marcia. I didn't keep track of her or check on what she was doing. I talked to Jenny every month, but we both carefully avoided any conversations about Marcia. All I knew was that she lost her house because of the bank and was working in a women's clothing store in one of the local shopping centers. Marcia told Jenny that Howard had 2 insurance policies in which his mother was listed as the beneficiary. Apparently, Mrs. Paddington didn't want to share. I had a few dinner dates, but nothing romantic or sexual. Later that same year, Jenny announced that she was getting married in June. I had met this guy a few times and was very pleased with her choice. The wedding was supposed to take place in Harrisburg, his hometown. Of course, the groom's father was going to pay for most of the expenses. I was more than willing to help in any way I could. The future groom had many more relatives than we did, so it all made sense. I agreed to attend and give away the bride if Jenny could assure me that I wouldn't have to sit next to Marcia or interact with her in any way. She reluctantly agreed. I didn't want to ruin my daughter's wedding, but I felt that if I was forced to interact with Marcia, the likelihood of a meltdown would be higher than if I simply avoided her. Besides buying a tuxedo, there was one more thing I had to do to prepare for the wedding. I felt devilish, or, better said, my mean streak came out. It was a beautiful wedding, wasn't it? Jenny kept her word. Everything was carefully organized so that Marcia and I could avoid each other without drawing attention. Although I was alone, Marcia was accompanied by a handsome guy about 50 years old. I never found out what their relationship was. He could have been a coworker, a neighbor, or her new boyfriend. Frankly, I didn't care. At the reception, Marcia and her escort sat in the far left corner of the head table while I was in the far right. I patiently waited for the father of the bride to give his toast. When it was my turn to speak, I crossed my fingers. It was a silly little prank, but I still wanted everything to go as planned. I'm right-handed, but today I held the glass in my left hand. The words that escaped my lips were inconsequential, but my gesture towards the room was. As I raised my left hand, the sleeve of my tuxedo slid down, revealing the beautiful Tag Heuer wristwatch with a black alligator leather strap. I held my hand up longer than necessary, ensuring that the exquisite watch was visible to everyone in the room. A sudden gasp from the far end of the table told me my mission was accomplished. I spoke a bit longer than usual, just to lighten the mood a bit. When I sat down, there was a wide smile on my face. Marcia saw the watch and recognized it. All the plans had paid off. A few minutes later, I saw my ex-wife and her escort leaving the room. She looked upset, but I couldn't tell if she was crying or not. I wandered around for another hour, playing the dutiful father, and then quietly left and returned to my hotel room. That night I slept restlessly. I wasn't sure what Marcia would do, or if she would do anything at all. If she did nothing, I would know she had come to terms with her fate and was ready to move on. If she was still upset about what happened, I might have visitors. The answer came at 6 in the morning. Mr. John Terrell, there were 2 of them, in dark suits. I suddenly had a vision of Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones in Independence Day. As I answered, I chuckled to myself. Yes, how can I help you? The dominant man in the suit introduced himself and his partner, then asked to come in. They were not locals, but from the state prosecutor's office. I wondered who had roused them from bed so early. I gestured for them to sit while I put on my pants. I had been expecting them, and I needed to get dressed before their arrival. There were only 2 chairs in the hotel room, so I sat on the unmade bed. I deliberately took more time than necessary to settle in. How can I help you, gentlemen? Are you the John Terrell who was at the Peterson-Terrell wedding yesterday? Certainly. Jenny Terrell, now Peterson, is my daughter. We were informed that during the reception you were wearing expensive, Tag Heuer watches. I reached for the bedside table and took out the large-sized watch. Yes, I was wearing these watches. Do you like them? That's not important, Mr. Terrell. What we would like to know is where did you get these watches? Why are you asking? Could you simply answer the question? No, you will tell me why you want to know where I got it and who told you that I have them, and I will answer your questions. Mr. Terrell, we're trying to make this as simple as possible. Could you just answer the question? Fine, I bought the watch on eBay. And now tell me why you want to know this. Watches, exactly like the ones you are holding, were taken from the body of a man killed in downtown 3 years ago. I'm sure there are many watches similar to these. Could you be a little more specific? They seemed a bit uneasy. I had a feeling they were just about to drag me into some government building to finish the conversation. Mr. Terrell, did you know a man named Howard Pattinson? Of course, I did. I used to work with him, and he's the man who had an affair with my wife. Which, by the way, led to my divorce. Mr. Pattinson had exactly the same watches when he was killed. How do you know that? There was no response from either of my visitors. Were there any watches with him when he was found? They both shook their heads in unison. Do you think these could be his watches? They were supposed to be in control of this unofficial interrogation, but it seemed like they were losing their composure. Who the hell told you these are Howard Pattinson's watches? Your wife, Mr. Terrell. Your wife identified the watches. And how did she know they were his watches? There was a slight hesitation. She claimed she bought them for him. Maybe you should talk to her about it? There was no response. And that's it? Is that all you need? There's an engraving on the back of the watches that will confirm her statement. Can she prove she bought these watches? She has a receipt. Damn it, I have a receipt too. Here, let me show you. They sat quietly as I pulled out a folded piece of paper from my wallet and handed it to them. The main guy glanced from the paper to me. This is from an online classified site. It says you bought the watches for $49. Yes, but I had to pay an extra $5 for shipping. You bought used Tag Heuer watches for $49? Not exactly. Take a closer look at the description. They both looked at the description and didn't notice the broad smile on my face. It says, Tag Heuer. Here, not Tag Heuer. Exactly. Look at the dial of the watch. Suit number 2 scrutinized the dial carefully as I handed it to him. He turned to his partner. It says, Tag Heuer. Here. Gentlemen, did my wife buy Mr. Pattinson Tag Heuer watches or did she buy Tag Heuer watches for him? Disappointment spread across both their faces. Things weren't going as planned for them. May we take a look at the back of the watch, Mr. Terrell? Do you want to check the engraving? Yes. Do you mind? No, not at all. I handed them the watch so they could examine it at their leisure. I made my point. I was buttoning my shirt as they both stood up to leave. Sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Terrell. Safe travels home. I closed the door after they left and looked at the watch. I was glad I spent an extra $20 on the engraving on the back of the watch. I turned it over and chuckled, reading the inscription in Old English. Eat shit and die. They could have easily checked the serial number of the watch, but that wouldn't have been nearly as amusing. I drove back to Baltimore, knowing that my wife was still unhappy with how I handled the situation. I guess I can't blame her, but I hoped there would be some remorse on her part. I was upset because she still wanted to hurt me or get even. It was she who cheated, not me. Perhaps it was time for me to get even. I threw the Tag Heuer watch out the car window and reached into the glove compartment. The difference could only be felt. Before putting on the real watch, I read the inscription for the 1000th time. Forever, Marcia. I couldn't stand wearing the watch, but maybe I could get used to wearing these. I'm going to see this through to the end, just like old Blue Eyes said.